It only took a gavel, a name on a docket, and 10 seconds of silence to turn a routine morning into a high-stakes showdown. In a courtroom that should have been quiet, procedural, forgettable, she was hit with a $110,000 fine. No hearing, no evidence, no chance to speak, just judgment, sudden and surgical. But here's the thing, they picked the wrong woman. Because Pam Bondi isn't just any defense attorney. She's the kind of lawyer who doesn't just know the law, she understands how to make it flinch. And that's exactly what she did. She turned the courtroom upside down. Challenged not one, but two judges live on record, and forced the justice system to do something it hates. Admit it was wrong. You're about to witness a masterclass in legal combat. A case that started with a grudge and ended with a message. Here at Black Footprints, we uncover the stories that power tried to bury. Stories that don't just entertain, but expose. So before we begin, do yourself a favor. Subscribe, because the truth doesn't always knock politely. Sometimes it walks into court and flips the script. Courtroom 3B was nothing new to Pam Bondi. The scent of polished oak benches, the rhythmic clatter of heels on marble, the faint buzz of fluorescent lighting above. A setting as familiar to her as the sound of her own voice arguing before a judge. She had stood at this defendant's table dozens, maybe hundreds of times before. To her, the courtroom wasn't intimidating. It was a chessboard, and she knew every square. That morning in Tampa was supposed to be routine. A minor municipal dispute. 10 minutes max. She had other appointments lined up, and a to-go coffee cup still warm in her bag. But the moment she walked in and saw who was presiding, the air changed, almost imperceptibly, like the sudden drop in pressure before a storm. Judge Kenneth Hale, tall, stern, his silver hair combed back like polished steel, and a gaze sharp enough to slice through legal briefs. Pam's eyes narrowed for just a beat. They hadn't crossed paths in a while, but the memory was fresh. The last time they clashed in court, she'd exposed a procedural misstep on his bench that nearly cost him a judicial review. Nothing had been proven, of course. But in the tightly wound world of courtrooms and reputations, almost was enough to plant a seed of bitterness. This wasn't just a judge. This was a man with a score to settle. Still, Pam didn't flinch. She set down her leather folder, adjusted the cuff of her navy blazer, and offered a composed nod to the clerk. If there was tension in the room, she wasn't going to be the one to blink first. Law wasn't just about knowing the rules. It was about knowing how to hold your ground when someone in a robe tried to shove you off it. The case? Barely worth a headline. A zoning violation buried in obscure municipal code. Something about improper signage or non-compliance with a newly passed regulation. The kind of thing that typically got resolved with a fine, a signature, and a mild apology. The city attorney barely looked up from his notes, confident the matter would be over before the stenographer finished typing the date. But something in the air fell off. Pam could feel it. A lawyer develops instincts over time, the way a sailor reads the wind. And right now, she smelled turbulence. Judge Hale entered the courtroom like a man walking onto his own personal stage. No pleasantries, no warm-ups, just a cold, clipped sentence that sliced through the silence. Let's get right to it. Pam straightened just slightly. This wasn't procedural efficiency. This was a man impatient to drop a hammer. There was no warning, no presentation of evidence, no room for argument. Judge Hale declared her in violation of Local Statute 14B and issued a staggering $110,000 fine on the spot, payable immediately. The clerk gasped. Even the city attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Pam didn't move. Her brows arched just slightly. Her mind raced, scanning legal grounds, constitutional precedents, and every inch of the ordinance in question. This wasn't justice. This was personal. What had been scheduled as a forgettable footnote in her day was now a blazing headline in the making. Pam wasn't just defending a technicality anymore. She was stepping into a ring where power, pride, and law were about to collide, and only one of them would walk away with their authority intact. So she did what she always did when the stakes changed. She smiled just barely, and got ready to fight. The blow came fast, too fast. Pam barely had time to place her notes on the table before Judge Kenneth Hale leaned forward, eyes cold, voice flat as concrete. This court finds the defendant in violation of Local Statute 14B. A fine of $110,000 is hereby imposed, effective immediately. There was no warning, no request for statements, no questions, no evidence, just judgment. The room fell into a stunned silence. Even the courtroom's usual ambient noise, the shuffle of papers, the click of pens, the soft murmur from the gallery, vanished in an instant. The city attorney looked over at Pam, his expression a mix of confusion and something almost like apology, as if even he hadn't expected the hammer to fall quite so abruptly. Pam didn't blink. On the outside, she was eyes calm, unreadable. But inside, her mind snapped into overdrive. 100 thoughts fired in less than a second. There was no procedural lead-in, no legal discussion, no acknowledgement of the defense. Hale hadn't even bothered to go through the motions of impartiality. This wasn't law. This was theater, and the message was loud and clear. You don't run this courtroom. I do. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a firm, decisive ruling. But Pam knew better. This wasn't about the statute. It wasn't about zoning violations or city codes. It was about her, about a grudge that had been festering since the day she challenged his authority and came out clean on the other side. She had embarrassed him once. He wasn't about to let her forget it. Hale was showing his cards early, an amateur's mistake when playing against someone like Pam Bondi. She tilted her head just slightly, as if processing the absurdity of it all. A $110,000 fine issued, without so much as a single argument heard, no evidentiary review, no record of a prior infraction, and under Statute 14B, no less. An ordinance so vague and inconsistently enforced that it had been contested in court more times than she could count. Pam folded her hands slowly, buying time, not because she needed it to gather her thoughts, but because timing was part of the performance. Let him sit in that silence. Let the tension thicken. Let the gallery start to question what they just witnessed. Then, with the calm precision of a surgeon, she spoke. Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the opportunity to present a single argument. Hale's eyes didn't flicker. The violation is clear. The law is clear. Pam inhaled once through her nose, slow and steady. So that's how it's going to be. This wasn't a ruling, it was a message. And while Hale may have thought he was closing the book, Pam knew better. He had just opened a chapter he wouldn't be able to control. The courtroom was watching now. Law clerks in the gallery leaned forward. A young associate from the city attorney's office scribbled something nervously in his notebook. Even the bailiff shifted slightly, sensing that the air had changed. Pam looked Hale straight in the eye. No defiance, no theatrics, just a calm, relentless steadiness. If the law were truly that clear, she said, her voice cool as steel, we wouldn't be here at all. It wasn't a challenge. Not yet, but it was a line in the sand. Pam Bondi didn't need a gavel to command a room. She needed one opportunity, just one crack in the foundation of that ruling, and she would pry it wide open. Because she wasn't just fighting a fine. She was fighting the idea that power meant immunity from being questioned. And she had no intention of letting that idea stand. Pam didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. After Judge Hale dropped his verdict like a guillotine, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. But Pam? She merely adjusted the stack of papers in front of her. Not because she needed them, but because posture was power. Then she looked up, her tone crisp, measured, unshakable. Your Honor, she began, I respectfully request the opportunity to present my defense. The ruling was issued before any proceeding began. That, with all due respect, contradicts basic procedural due process. The words landed like a tremor beneath the marble floor. Judge Hale leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. It was the first crack in his mask. The courtroom, which moments earlier had been lulled into silence, began to stir. A few heads turned. A clerk whispered something to her colleague. Even the city attorney lowered his pen, sensing something had shifted. Pam's gaze was locked on Hale, not with aggression, but with the precision of someone who knew exactly where the fault lines lay. Statute 14b, she said, tapping the printed ordinance with the tip of her finger, has been challenged repeatedly over the last 5 years. In Reynolds versus Clearwater, in Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. Each case highlighted the same issue. The language is vague, the enforcement inconsistent, and in multiple instances, rulings were overturned because the statute failed to meet constitutional clarity and due process standards. She let that hang in the air, not rushing, letting the implications sink in. Your Honor, precedent matters. When administrative penalties are imposed without evidentiary presentation, without procedural allowance for defense, we step out of the realm of justice and into something far more dangerous: arbitrary authority. Judge Hale's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, which told her everything. Pam had studied the man long enough to recognize his tactics. He was authoritative, yes, but also prideful. And pride, when prodded with precision, would either back down or lash out. The city attorney shifted in his seat, now fully alert, flipping through his own notes as if searching for footing. It was subtle, but it was there. Pam had them both off balance, and they knew it. She continued, her tone calm, deliberate, but now carrying a quiet intensity. "I'm not asking this court to ignore the law," she said. "I'm asking it to follow it. Because the minute we accept rulings that bypass procedure and silence defense, we turn the courtroom from a place of fairness into a stage for unchecked decisions. And that, Your Honor, sets a precedent no one should be comfortable defending." Judge Hale leaned forward, lacing his fingers. "Miss Bondi, this court does not entertain theatrics." Pam offered the faintest smile. "Neither do I. I prefer the law." A murmur rippled through the back rows. Law students, clerks, a few old attorneys waiting for their own hearings. Something was happening, and everyone could feel it. Pam wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was unseating the very certainty of Hale's authority. She had shifted the burden. No longer the target, she had become the aggressor, armed not with arrogance, but with facts, precedent, and poise. And for the first time since entering the courtroom, it was Judge Kenneth Hale who had to defend his position. The courtroom wasn't a battlefield. It was a chessboard, and Pam Bondi had just moved her queen. Mid-sentence, Pam caught a flicker of movement from the gallery. It wasn't much, just the subtle lift of 2 fingers and a tap to the side of an old leather-bound notebook. But in a room where silence reigned and every breath was calculated, the gesture stood out like a spark in dry grass. Pam didn't break rhythm, didn't let her gaze linger, but she saw him. Third row, far end. A man in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, silver hair, combed neatly, suit sharp despite the years etched into his face. He wasn't whispering to anyone, wasn't scribbling notes, just watching. Watching with the eyes of someone who had been on the other side of that bench, who had once worn the robe. Pam knew that face. Robert Klein, a name whispered in legal circles with equal parts reverence and regret. Once a respected judge in the same circuit, he had mysteriously resigned nearly a decade ago after a high-profile zoning case had gone south. Ironically, under the same statute Hale was trying to wield against Pam now. The official story was health issues. But rumor had it Judge Hale, then a rising star in the judiciary, had leveraged procedural missteps to force Klein out, humiliating him in the process. And now here he was, quietly sitting in the back of the courtroom like a ghost returning to the scene of the crime. Pam's eyes flicked back to her papers, but her mind was racing. That gesture, he had tapped twice, then pointed, almost imperceptibly, to a sticky note wedged into his notebook. Supplement C. Pam's fingers moved instinctively, flipping through the ordinance packet she had prepared. She had reviewed it a dozen times in the days leading up to this hearing, but now, under pressure, she turned to the back pages and scanned for what most attorneys overlooked, the appendices. There it was. Appendix C. Small print. Almost an afterthought. But as she read, the air around her seemed to tighten. A clause buried at the bottom. Enforcement actions under Statute 14b must be accompanied by visual or written documentation submitted under sworn testimony, as defined in subparagraph 14b, C.1. Her eyes locked on that line. Then again, sworn testimony, documentation, neither of which had been presented in this case. Pam looked up slowly. Judge Hale was watching her now, suspicious. The shift in her expression hadn't gone unnoticed. But he didn't know what she had just found. Not yet. She returned her gaze to the old man in the gallery. He met her eyes for the briefest second, then nodded once, small, restrained but deliberate. Pam felt the fire catch in her chest. Not rage, not panic. Purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something older, deeper. A game that had been played long before today, one she had unknowingly stepped into, and was now determined to finish. "Your Honor," she said, her tone calm but laced with something new, an undercurrent of quiet defiance. "Before we proceed further, I'd like to draw your attention to an often overlooked provision in Appendix C of Statute 14b. Hale's brow furrowed. The city attorney sat up straighter. In cases where fines are issued without evidentiary submission, the statute explicitly requires either photographic proof or sworn testimony by the enforcing officer. As of this moment, Your Honor, neither has been provided. The room froze. The words hadn't just landed, they detonated. Pam turned a page, tapping the highlighted section as she spoke. The law you're attempting to enforce has limits. You just didn't expect someone to read that far. And in the gallery, the ghost of Judge Klein sat quietly, hands folded, the faintest trace of a smile curving across his weathered face. He'd passed the baton, and Pam Bondi had just picked it up. Pam didn't hesitate. She knew when to strike, and this was the moment. Holding up the printed ordinance like a blade drawn from its sheath, she turned squarely to the bench. Your Honor, Appendix C requires sworn testimony or physical documentation before any enforcement under Statute 14b can be imposed. Neither exists in this case. Therefore, this fine isn't just premature, it's procedurally invalid. A hush rippled across the room. Judge Hale's jaw tensed, the veins at his temple pulsing beneath the pressure. For a man who had ruled with such surgical control just minutes ago, he now looked off balance. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared down at the page she held up like it was foreign. He knew the clause, of course. He just never expected anyone to call out, much less in open court. Then, with a forced calm, he leaned back and said, "This court will take a short recess." The gavel came down hard, not with finality, but frustration. Pam didn't move. She simply returned to her seat and placed the paper back on the table, hands steady. She had him cornered, not because of theatrics or charisma, but because she did the one thing that no one expected in that courtroom. She read the damn footnotes. 15 minutes passed like an hour. She sat alone at the defense table while murmurs floated from the gallery like smoke. The energy had shifted, everyone felt it. She wasn't the underdog anymore. She was the one forcing the system to pause, to reconsider, to scramble. But when the courtroom doors swung open again, the mood turned electric. Pam turned her head and froze, not in fear, but in recognition. Judge Alan Whitaker, Sr., federal appointment, known for sharp intellect and zero tolerance for procedural games. A man rarely seen in local municipal courtrooms, unless something unusual was going down. Judge Hale stepped in behind him, chin high, expression unreadable. But to Pam, it was clear what this was, a call for backup. Whitaker took his place beside Hale without much ceremony. Hale cleared his throat. For the record, I've requested Judge Whitaker's presence for the remainder of this hearing. Pam's lips curled into a slow, restrained smile. Requested, right? This wasn't a reinforcement. It was an attempted rescue. Judge Whitaker nodded toward her. Ms. Bondi, I understand you've raised questions concerning the enforceability of Statute 14b, particularly referencing Appendix C and the lack of evidentiary support. She met his gaze, voice calm and steady. Correct, Your Honor. And based on both current precedent and the statute itself, the fine issued is unsupportable under law. Whitaker leaned slightly forward. Are you aware that a clarification was issued post-Henderson v. Petersburg, allowing for some local discretion in enforcement of 14b, depending on municipal interpretation? Pam didn't blink. Yes, I'm aware of that clarification. I'm also aware that it explicitly ties that discretion to compliance with evidentiary standards, which, as I've just demonstrated, has not occurred here. Hale shifted beside Whitaker, visibly frustrated. He had brought in a heavyweight to push back, but Pam wasn't giving an inch. In fact, she was now arguing against two judges, on record, and holding her ground like a fortress built on case law. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. And you're prepared to assert that the fine is unconstitutional based on lack of due process. Pam leaned forward slightly. Not just assert it. Prove it. Gasps flickered through the gallery. Pam wasn't speaking in hypotheticals. She was laying down facts like bricks, building a wall that neither judge could climb without risking public embarrassment or reversal on appeal. This wasn't a defense anymore. It was a counteroffensive. Two judges. One seasoned attorney. And somehow, Pam Bondi was the one dictating the tempo. The message was clear. If they wanted a fight, they had picked the wrong woman to corner. It was the kind of moment that cracked open a courtroom, not with noise but with stillness. Officer Brian Calloway took the stand with the confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times. Mid-50s, pressed Navy uniform, a badge that gleamed under the courtroom lights. He looked the part. Serious, seasoned, untouchable. He took the oath, sat down, and folded his hands like a man who had nothing to hide. Pam stood slowly, her posture calm, unthreatening. But her questions, when they came, were surgical. "Officer Calloway," she began, "you were the one who issued the violation to my client, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And can you tell the court what documentation accompanied that citation?" There was a pause. The kind that doesn't just hang in the air, it echoes. Calloway cleared his throat. "There was no documentation per SC. I observed the infraction personally." Pam tilted her head slightly. "So no photographs? No written witness statements? No time-stamped report?" "No, ma'am. Not necessary. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know what I'm looking at." The words landed with the weight of a wet sponge. Pam didn't react. Not visibly, but the shift in the room was palpable. Whitaker adjusted his glasses. Hale scribbled something furiously on a notepad. In the gallery, someone actually leaned forward in their seat like they were watching a plot twist unfold. Pam stepped closer, voice still soft, almost conversational. "Officer, I don't doubt your experience. But help me understand. On what legal basis do you determine that your personal assessment, without any supporting evidence, qualifies as sufficient grounds for a $110,000 fine?" Calloway hesitated, then reached for the only defense he had left. "I go by instinct. You develop a feel for these things." Pam smiled faintly, as if she'd just been handed a gift wrapped in blue ribbon. "Instinct," she repeated, turning back toward the bench. "Your Honors, what we have here is a violation enforced not by law, but by gut feeling. No record, no photos, no independent verification. Just a man's belief that what he saw constitutes legal cause." She let the silence work for her. It hung there, thick and heavy. Appendix C, as we've discussed, demands either physical documentation or sworn testimony supported by evidence. Not intuition. Not "I've seen this before." Then, more pointedly, we do not find citizens' six figures based on vibes. A low murmur rolled through the courtroom. Half chuckle, half shock. Pam continued, her voice harder now, sharpened by precision. "If this ruling is allowed to stand, what precedent are we setting? That any enforcement officer can issue financial penalties based on nothing more than their belief? That due process is optional? That evidence is no longer a requirement, just a courtesy?" Judge Whitaker leaned forward, elbows on the bench, his face unreadable. Pam pressed on. "We all know what that leads to. Arbitrary punishment, selective enforcement, an erosion of the very foundation of our legal system. And I don't believe anyone in this courtroom wants to defend that kind of future, not even the court itself." She turned toward Calloway, eyes steady. "Officer, I'm not accusing you of bad faith, but the law doesn't operate on good faith alone. It operates on proof. And without it, no ruling, not even one handed down in this courtroom, can withstand scrutiny." There it was. The gallery had gone silent again. Whitaker leaned back. Hale looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. And Calloway? His confidence had deflated entirely, like a balloon left out in the cold. Pam stepped back to the defense table, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She didn't need to say more. The damage was done. The burden had shifted. And now, for the first time, the court was no longer scrutinizing her, but scrutinizing itself. There's a point in every battle where the air changes, not from the words spoken, but from who's listening. As Pam Bondi laid out her final argument, her voice calm but laced with steel, something subtle shifted in the room. It wasn't just about Statute 14b anymore. It wasn't about procedures or fines or even the judges seated high above her. It was about something bigger, something more human. It was about being heard. And just then, a faint click broke through the silence, followed by the software of a phone being adjusted on a mini tripod. A young woman in the gallery, maybe early 30s, dark-rimmed glasses, and notepad still in her lap, tapped her screen twice. Live. Pam noticed it immediately. So did Judge Hale. He stiffened. The lens of the phone wasn't just pointed toward the bench. It was pointed toward the very heart of the system. The world was now watching. "Are you filming?" Hale asked sharply. The woman didn't flinch. "I'm a reporter, Your Honor. Public hearing. Freedom of the press." The judge looked ready to object, but he knew better. This wasn't a backroom proceeding. It was open court, and in a moment of crisis, the Fourth Estate had just walked through the door. And then it happened. From the last row, a quiet sob broke the hush. Heads turned. A woman, late 50s, maybe early 60s, sat with her hands clenched in her lap, shoulders trembling. She didn't hide her tears. She didn't try to make a scene. She just let it fall out of her, raw and real. Pam recognized her. She had represented the woman 2 years earlier in a nearly identical case. Another 14b nightmare. A simple parking violation that spiraled into a business closure, a foreclosure notice, and nearly a mental breakdown. All because an overzealous officer had issued a citation without proper cause. The case was thrown out, but the damage had been done. Now she sat there, crying not just for herself, but for every person who'd ever been steamrolled by a system that prized speed over fairness, obedience over rights. And the gallery saw her, saw them. The energy in the courtroom pulsed with something electric, solidarity. Quiet but unmistakable. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff cleared his throat. Even Judge Whitaker cast a glance toward the back of the room, his normally stoic face betraying a flicker of reflection. Pam didn't have to say anything more. The room had already decided whose side it was on, because this wasn't just about one woman challenging a fine. It was about the invisible weight people carried when power is wielded without accountability. It was about the fatigue of fighting systems that don't listen until someone forces them to. Now, the court wasn't an echo chamber. It was a theater with an audience, a camera, and an unwritten ending hanging in the air. And Hale? He felt it. For the first time in years, the gavel in his hand didn't feel like authority. It felt like pressure. The kind of pressure that comes when the people you're judging are finally looking right back at you. Pam glanced at the woman in the back row and gave her a subtle nod. Not a victory lap, not a headline moment. Just one woman telling another, "I see you. You matter." And for once, the courtroom wasn't just a place where laws were read. It was a place where justice was felt. The gavel came down softer this time, almost reluctant. Judge Kenneth Hale cleared his throat, jaw clenched so tight you could hear the tension in his voice. This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement, he said stiffly. The fine is hereby overturned. And just like that, it was over. No applause, no cheers, just a wave of stunned silence rolling through the courtroom like a quiet earthquake. The kind that doesn't break buildings, but rearranges everything inside them. Pam didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, her face unreadable. No fist pump, no smirk, just quiet, composed victory. Because she knew what this was, not just a win on paper, but a crack in the foundation of unchecked authority. Judge Hale avoided eye contact as he rose and disappeared through the side door, his robe flaring behind him like the final curtain of a failed performance. The city attorney followed closely, his file still unopened. Pam gathered her papers slowly, deliberately. She wasn't in a rush, not because she had nowhere to be, but because moments like this were rare. You don't walk away from a courtroom like this unchanged. She turned toward the exit, heels clicking softly on the polished floor, the gallery parting like quiet waves. But before she could reach the door, a voice stopped her. "Ms. Bondi." She turned. Judge Whitaker stood a few paces away, hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. The courtroom had mostly emptied now. Just him and her, and the echo of something unspoken. "I wanted to speak to you briefly," he said. "Off the record." Pam tilted her head. "Of course, Your Honor." He stepped closer, his tone low, almost fatherly. "You argued well today. Brilliantly, in fact." "Thank you," she said cautiously. He paused, then added, "I wasn't brought in to observe, Pam. I was brought in to contain you." Pam didn't respond immediately. She let the words settle, their weight heavier than any judgment passed that day. Whitaker continued, voice even. "This case wasn't just about a fine. It was about precedent, about power, about who gets to question the rules, and who's punished for doing so." Pam nodded slowly. "I figured as much." He studied her, then said, more softly, "You made enemies today. Not in this room, but in places you haven't seen yet. You'll be watched closely, because you didn't just win, you challenged a system that doesn't like being challenged." There was no menace in his voice, only truth. Pam smiled, small and sharp. "Let them watch." Whitaker offered a faint nod, then turned back toward the courtroom without another word. Pam pushed through the heavy courthouse doors, stepping into the bright Florida sun. The air felt lighter, warmer, like something had been lifted, not just from her shoulders, but from the very space she'd walked through. She knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning. It was a reminder that the law isn't just words in a book. It's a living thing, bent, broken, and rebuilt by those with the courage to test its boundaries. And today, she had done just that. Not for glory, not for applause, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that somewhere out there, a judge would now think twice before skipping due process. An officer would hesitate before writing a baseless citation. And a woman sitting in the back of a courtroom, once voiceless, would remember what it felt like to be seen. Pam Bondi didn't just walk out of that courthouse a winner. She walked out a warning.